of terminology, which you just put on the board, and if you can't read my handwriting, just let me know. I think I'm going to make a habit of doing this every once in a while, just putting various words, various technical terms up on the board, basically for the sake of expanding your vocabulary. The reason why I'm going to choose to do this is because, well, actually there are two really good reasons. A, because getting subtle or complicated thoughts of your own, articulating your own experiences or articulating your own understanding of things becomes much easier the more expansive the vocabulary that you have on hand to make use of, right? Because not every word means every other word, but being able to make very fine distinctions between things will help you out considerably over the course of your life. It's very much the case, no matter what anybody wants to say to the contrary, that our thoughts, even though they're not completely determined by language, are very much expanded upon or made more subtle, made more subtle, and made more, in a sense, almost made freer by having an expansive language or set of languages on hand by which to make sense of ourselves, to make sense of the meanings that we're trying to get at. The second reason is that there are a whole bunch of technical terms, mostly inherited from Greece or Rome, which have come back into vogue now in political science in particular, but the social sciences more generally, which, for lack of a better or gentler way of saying it, have been completely bastardized. The historical reasons for this are fairly complicated. The simplistic version is that the social sciences and political science in particular were basically devastated about 60 or 70 years ago in North America in the advent of certain revolutions, or termed revolutions, in intellectual thought. And one of the consequences of these revolutions was that a tremendous amount of scientific heritage was actually intentionally thrown out the window. And so most of the originating experiences or the insights which had been gained either in the ancient classical period or even the medieval period were dismissed as being antiquated or useless, and were instead replaced by a lot of what was oftentimes pseudo-scientific jargon. Now, if you guys have been in university probably for a couple of years now, and you probably run across a lot of jargon. And what you may have sensed at times, depending on who your teachers are, is that, or who you're reading, is that at times words are getting used which don't seem to actually refer to anything in particular, but are used in a way which is almost engaging in a form of intellectual bullying. They throw around words, for instance, some of my favorites are epistemology and ontology, and don't ever define what they mean. But act as if you should know what they mean, because of course you're not stupid, right? You know what epistemology is, you know what ontology is. Now, personally, what I often find the case to be is that in many of the subfields of political science these days, these words have come back into vogue in order to try to grapple with certain experiences, certain thoughts, or certain realities which have been eclipsed for the last several decades. But the vast majority of people using these words do not actually know what they mean. And I'm not simply speaking about students, I'm also speaking about people with oftentimes very prestigious degrees from very prestigious universities, oftentimes from Ivy League colleges and universities. So if you ever find that the word epistemology is getting bandied about in an article you're forced to read for a class, and you cannot figure out for the life of you what the hell they're talking about, I'm going to suggest to you, not with any certainty, of course, that it's very possible that the person writing that article also does not know what the hell they're talking about. And so what I'm going to give you is just kind of a basic definition of what some of these terms mean, both so that you have them on hand for your own work, but also so you can see through some of the fog which gets thrown up in academia these days. The first and most important one, especially given the content we're going to be going through for this particular lecture, is the word episteme. As you can tell pretty straight off, most of these words are in Greek. There's a very good reason for that. Even up to this day, ancient Greek is still considered the language of philosophy. And even in modern, ultra 21st century modern science, we still make recourse to Greek and to a lesser extent Latin in order to make very fine distinctions about scientific matters. We won't go into the reason why for that, except to say basically Greek, ancient Greek at least, is an incredibly subtle language and able to get through very, very fine distinctions, which you cannot actually make in most modern languages. I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, episteme, my preferred translation of this word is simply understanding. Another common translation is the word knowledge. I don't particularly favor that translation because there are also approximately 11 other words in Greek which can be translated as knowledge, and so it's not terribly helpful. The word understanding, though, more or less gets at what, for instance, philosophers like Plato or Aristotle were getting at when they used the word. If you've been reading through the study of man, you see that Polanyi himself is very much focusing upon getting to the root of what understanding is in this particular book. In fact, he does so in most of his books, but in this book in particular, understanding comes to the forefront. So episteme, understanding. Epistemology is just a compound word. First part of the compound word is the word episteme. The second part of the compound word is logos. Now, logos, unfortunately, is one of those words which has a range of meanings. For our purposes, it just means like a verbal or written account. So an epistemology literally means nothing more, nothing less than a person's account of what they understand understanding to be, right? And so there's no such thing, for instance, as my epistemology or the epistemology we're going to adopt for this article or this book. An epistemology is either more or less correct or more or less specious. Either you really have a sense of what understanding is or you don't. Your understanding does not vary from my understanding. Her understanding does not vary for his understanding. There is simply understanding qua understanding. Anybody who starts off an article saying my epistemology is should already be taken with a grain of salt. Ontos is the Greek term for being or reality. Those are two different ways of translating that word. And ontology, obviously, compound word. First word, ontos, second word, logos. So it literally means an account of reality. Anybody who starts talking about their ontology is talking about their reality. Now, anybody who claims to be a scientist and starts talking about their own particular reality may be a little bit out to lunch. That's not what the word ontology means. Ontology means a more or less good account of the structure of reality as it actually is, irrespective of what anybody wants it to be. Very basic, very straightforward, and very commonsensical once you get past all the fog. Last but not least, I've given you three versions of some terms we went over last week, but I wasn't completely satisfied with the translations I gave you guys last week. One alternative translation of the word epiron, one which actually gets used by Plato, or gets sort of used by Plato, was just simply the word space. Space qua space. It also has all those other connotations I gave you last week, but this one is one which you're going to run across more often across languages. Because the word apiron, it's not something which is used terribly often outside of very particular circles these days. So things arise out of space, things disappear back into space at the end of the day. To all things there is a season. Things pop into existence, things pop out of existence. That's what we call birth and death, or becoming and unbecoming, if you will. And then I gave you like 5 different alternate translations of the word noesis, which is the root word for what Vogan was calling psyche noetic on the Vogelin's table. Noesis can be translated as thought. It can be translated as thinking. One very important one, you got to put an asterisk next to this one because this is something which happens in late medieval history. It gets translated at one point as natural reason. Now this is a very important discovery which was remade by Vogelin about 50 or 60 years ago. The term natural reason pops up in history, in Western history, because basically there's this internal intellectual fight which goes on in the Roman Catholic Church. The antecedents of it go back to the patristic fathers, around about the 3rd and 4th century AD, and gets taken up again in late medieval history. And It comes about because there was a certain sect or a certain faction within the intellectual elite of the church which wanted to make a huge distinction between what they wanted to call reason and what they wanted to call revelation, and they wanted to hold them completely separate. To make a long story short, this is something which is very, very peculiar to the Western church. Neither Plato, for instance, nor Aristotle, nor even some of the other Christian forefathers like Augustine recognizes this distinction as being valid. But anyway, the terminology of natural reason gets taken up by thinkers who are not terribly Christian, shall we say. But one of the effects of this attempt to redefine what reason is in order to make it distinct from revelation is that later secular atheistic thinkers follow along with the basic premise that reason somehow is subject-object orientated purely. That it simply deals with either physical, sensible objects or with mental objects, and that's all there is to it. That's just something to keep in mind as you're reading through some of these thinkers. Other two translations are intellection, and one which I underlined is inductive thought. So some of you brought up the image of the myth of the cave from Plato's Republic last time. So noesis would be that process of thinking either by yourself or with other people by which you ascend out of the cave. Dianoesis is a form of noesis, but it's a form of noesis which is more deductive. So you're taking certain premises or certain ideas or thoughts as true and given, and then you're just following through a chain of logic from there. The literal translation would be noesis, necessary noesis. At any rate, because we're trying to get at some fairly subtle distinctions throughout this course, you might find that I will typically use the Greek rather than the English most of the time, just in order to make sure we're keeping things separate and parsed properly. So when I talk about nous, I'm talking about what last time we're talking about as divine reason or capital R reason. I'm talking about noesis, I'm talking about this. Inductive thinking, but inductive thinking using language and yeah, basically that. Okay? Any questions about that before we launch in on Polanyi? Once again, as with everything else, we'll be going over these things over and over again, and you'll basically hopefully pick up most of this simply by context, because human beings are really good at doing that. You don't necessarily have to have everything thought out for you. You can just figure it out for yourselves. You'll do it naturally, I hope. All right. So on to Polanyi. Basically, everybody's got a copy of the book now. Does anybody not have a copy of the book? Sorry, Debbie. Everybody's good? Okay, Bobby? Lexicon. All right. So some basic historical facts about Polanyi, at least off the top of my head. Michael Polanyi was born to a Jewish emigre family in the Austro-Hungarian Empire back around 1899 or so. His family, from what I can tell or dig up, came to the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a result of some of the pogroms which were going off within the context of the Russian Empire about a generation back. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a relatively liberal place. It was a monarchy. However, compared to the Russian monarchy, it was comparatively safe and comparatively progressive. In fact, a tremendous amount, I believe, of the Russian Jewish population of a previous era actually moved into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, specifically because they got tired of being killed by the Russian aristocrats or the Russian authorities. Now, Michael Polanyi, along with several of his siblings, and it's basically a family of geniuses, was very well educated. I believe he did most of his degrees at the University of Marburg, which would be in modern-day Austria, I believe. He did his initial education, actually, as a physician. So he was an actual practicing doctor for a good number of years. In fact, he served as a medic on the front lines during the First World War on the Austro-Hungarian side, obviously. Later on, he switched out of medicine and went into chemistry. And he was an extremely, extremely successful chemist. In fact, you can still pull up some of his papers on JSTOR if you're ever inclined to. And he did make some notable contributions to the advancement of chemistry back in his day. And he was so practiced, in fact, that he actually passed on the passion to his son, one John Polanyi, who later won the Nobel Prize sometime back in the 1980s. And his son, John, actually still teaches, I believe, as an emeritus professor at the University of Toronto, which would probably make him the only Canadian professor with a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Anyway, as things tend to go, most of the family was driven out of Austria after the breakup, basically because the Nazis were on the horizon. We're talking about the 1920s and 1930s. The Nazi Party was on the horizon and finally took over Germany, and it was very, very obvious that they had their sights on absorbing Austria into the German, or rather the Nazi Empire of the time. And so Michael Polanyi, Karl Polanyi, and a few other siblings and family members made haste to actually leave the country before they showed up on the doorstep. Michael ended up at the University of Manchester in England. Karl, I can't remember where Karl ended up first, but he eventually ended up in the States. At any rate, at one point or another, starts really in the 1930s, but really starts picking up steam in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Michael becomes increasingly troubled by a various number of things which are going on in Western civilization at the time. The most obvious spur for this is the spectacular self-destruction of European civilization, which is going on. He's already lived through one world war, and he's witnessing another one unfold, which is even more vicious than the first one. And like many other sensitive people of the time, he's asking what the hell is going on here? Why is this supposedly liberal progressive civilization not only engaging in, for instance, in all these imperialist enterprises overseas, but why is it literally tearing itself apart at the seams? Why is it degenerating into this nasty barbarism? What the hell gave rise to Nazis and the radical Bolsheviks on the Eastern Front, right? These are driving questions. And for Polanyi, he thinks he spots, and he's not alone in this, he thinks he spots the roots of this disorder in a very peculiar turn in Western intellection, in the intellectual life of the West, which in the context of another book he calls objectivism. And what he's describing as objectivism is this very, very deeply held belief of intellectuals of his era, and intellectuals to a good extent up to our own time and right now and right here in this university, who think that the only thing which constitutes knowledge or proof of knowledge is that which can be represented in very clear and precise terms as an idea in a book or in language or in some literally objective form. And what he sees as being the case, or the faith behind this incredible intellectual movement which had taken place over 3 or 4 centuries in the West, is this faith in what he terms in various points as the Laplacian mind. Now, Laplace was, I think he was primarily a physicist, but he also did some work on astronomy and some other things back, I believe, in the 18th century, though it could be wrong. Laplace is most famously known in philosophical circles for this kind of, what would you call it, a sort of mental experiment which he conducted, which kind of really well sums up the intellectual disposition of the European intellectual elite in his own day and afterwards. And This intellectual story is the story of Laplace's demon. Now, Laplace's demon is pretty straightforward. Laplace posited, for instance, that if you could imagine, for the sake of argument, a demon gifted with infinite calculative ability, infinite calculative precision, and that demon was then fed, in one brief snapshot, the exact location and the exact velocity of every particle in the universe, Laplace posited that that demon would effectively be omniscient, because it was supposed that because of the calculative ability of the supposed demon and the knowledge, like the objective knowledge of every particle and its velocity in the universe, that that demon would then thereafter be able to calculate the position of every atom in the universe thereafter, simply by being able to calculate all the collisions and so on and so forth which would go on. So this demon would effectively know everything. Now this kind of sums up in a brief way the basic intellectual faith of Europe of the time. That is to say that if it could break everything down to its most fundamental constituents, that is to say atoms or particles or what have you, and then determine with reasonable precision the place and velocity of every one of those parts, then you know everything about it. And what's entailed in this position are two things. A, that what is most fundamental and meaningful about a thing is the most basic parts of it. And B, what was I going to say? A, that the parts are more important than the whole, basically. And that B, what is most important about this sort of disposition is the ability to express this information about the parts in explicit terms. So there are two things being said here. A, what constitutes knowledge is only that which can be said, that which can be represented in words or images or in some mathematical formula, for instance. And B, what is most important are the parts, the most basic parts you can get your hands on, or which you can observe. Now, one of the problems that Polanyi has with this, and which he tries to point out, is that in essence, this is nonsense. And he's going to, throughout the study of man and most of his works, he builds a greater and greater argument for why this has to be taken as nonsense. What we're going to focus on for this occasion is his theory of tacit knowledge. Now, as far as Polanyi's theory of tacit knowledge is concerned, the initial question which should come up, of course, is what is tacit knowledge and how does it differ from explicit knowledge? And Polanyi himself has a very pithy way of putting this forth. As he puts it, the basic truth of the matter is that you always know more than you can actually tell. Right? That there are reams and reams of examples from your own life and from the lives of others which go to show that you know things which you cannot actually explain in any kind of explicit terms whatsoever. And some of the examples he gives are very earthy and very kind of down to earth, not terribly mysterious. And he talks about, for instance, the example of the blind man and the cane, and how the blind man and the cane is able to suss out an understanding or a comprehension of the world around them simply by, as he puts it, indwelling in the cane and attending not to feel the impacts in his hand, but rather what the impacts in his hand mean. He's really attending to as a focal point, that which is at the tip of the cane. Right? Alternatively, he gives another very earthly example of riding a bicycle. And this one probably hits home more for most of you who probably haven't experimented with, tapping away in the dark, which is that you don't learn how to use a bicycle by reading a bicycle manual. You learn to ride a bicycle by riding a bicycle. And there's a certain amount of advice somebody who knows how to use a bicycle can give you before you get on there and start pedaling. However, at the end of the day, that advice only brackets in the range of mistakes or stupid things you might do before getting on there. And that if anybody was to simply if your parents, for instance, your father or your mother, had simply handed you the manual to your bicycle and told you to get on it and do your thing, obviously the results would have been disastrous. Because no matter how precisely that manual had been written by the technician or by the technical writer, even if, for instance, the technician had been knowledgeable enough to give you the very precise formulae, the actual mathematical formulae for exactly how much tension, exactly what angles, and exactly what sort of force to put on the pedals while manipulating the handlebars, while doing this, while doing that, and all the literally hundreds of other different things which you are doing in order to keep yourself upright and going forward on the bike. Even if they had been able to represent all that information in a more or less concise fashion in the manual, and even if you somehow, by some force of sheer memorization, have been able to put that all in your head and keep it in your head while trying to ride a bicycle, it would be of absolutely no use to you whatsoever. Because nobody is going to go through a series of explicit algorithms in their head while trying to ride a bike unless they want to fall down or hit a tree. The way you actually ride a bike is by getting on a bike, messing around until you eventually figure it out. And having had the experience of riding a bike, successfully hopefully, but even unsuccessfully, you learn certain things about the limits and possibilities which make riding a bike properly possible. You learn what to do and you learn what not to do. And you slowly refine your procedure, not by trying to think through a set of procedures in your head, but rather by attending focally to the task of staying upright and going forward. And the more self-conscious you are about the whole procedure, if you start focusing on your feet, if you start focusing on your hands, if you start focusing too much on any particular aspect of the act, chances are the whole thing will fall apart and you will fall down, plain and simple, right? And so Polanyi admits right off the bat, there are some very explicit formulaic things which you can tell your friend about riding a bicycle. However, at the end of the day, you can't transmit the most important parts. The best you can do is keep them from doing anything which is blatantly stupid or blatantly dangerous. So this leads us to an additional question, or a follow-up question. It was, what then is the difference between tacit and focal awareness, which is another topic which comes up in the book. Now, I've kind of already hinted at it, obviously, because I'm already using the language here. But the difference between tacit and focal awareness is simply that when one is attending focally to a particular act, or to a particular deed, or to a particular question which one is trying to answer, a particular problem one is trying to suss out, what you do, whether you're ever thought about it or not, is that what you're actually doing is you're allowing a vast majority or a vast amount of knowledge and preconceptions and half thought out understandings that you have fall into the background and become sort of the background material through which or from which you attend to that which is the focus of your attention. So, for instance, when you're trying to ride the bike for the first time and you know basically how to do it and you're trying to attend to the object, which is riding the bike, you don't think too much about all the things which are going on, for instance, in your own body. You are not focally aware of pumping your legs. You're not focally aware of whatever may or may not be going on inside your own eyeball, in your own perceptive apparatuses, in your own senses. But rather, you're letting all these things fall into the background in a way that you're not unaware of them. The language Polanyi is using is that you're tacitly aware of them, or they become part of your subsidiary awareness, right? It's in the same way that when you're trying to hammer a nail, you don't think about your hand when you're hammering the nail. You think about pounding the damn nail into the wood. And if you start attending too focally, either to the hammer itself, or to your hand, or to your arm, or to your own eyes, then you're going to do a progressively worse and worse job of the whole thing. In order for the entire act to flow properly, you have to have your attention focus on the purpose or the end which you're trying to achieve. And everything else has to kind of fall into the background awareness, the tacit awareness of the act. And so what does it mean for something to be subsidiary in our knowledge or subsidiary in awareness? It's simply that, is that much as you might say, for instance, that the sum of a comprehensive object or entity is more than a sum of its parts, is that in order to really know something, in order to really comprehend what we're doing and to do it properly, we have to allow those parts of our awareness, those parts of what we know, those parts of our understanding to come together as part of a comprehensive understanding or comprehensive know-how, right? You know how to focus your eyes on something that you're looking at. You know how to move your legs. You know how to move your hands. You know how to use handlebars, hopefully. You know how to use pedals. All these are pieces of subsidiary knowledge which, in the explicit act of trying to use the bicycle and use it properly, you're allowing to come together in a higher form of knowledge, which is putting all this stuff together in order to ride the bike. Anybody have any questions about that? Or is that confusing for anybody? I'm going to go into something else. Now, you might ask, why is this important, and why does Polanyi start with this when he's attempting to get at, once again, this problem of the self-destruction of Western civilization, or at least of European civilization? Now, one of the reasons why Polanyi is doing this is that this is basically the basis for a systematic retortion of the pretenses of the Laplacian mind. That is to say, of some of the central premises of European intellectual life in his own day, or up to his own day. Because as we're going to see, or as you start to see, as you think along with Polanyi through this book, is you start to see is that this form of knowledge, or this theory of tacit knowledge, doesn't merely hold weight, or is not merely the case for certain kinds of knowing. For instance, the know-how involved in physical activities or physical processes. But as he puts it, is the case, or is predominantly the case, that tacit awareness is most important at both as he puts it, the most basic levels, but also the loftiest levels of human knowledge and awareness. And in between those very basic levels and those very lofty heights of human understanding, there is this vast middle ground in which the tacit and explicit aspects of our awareness and our understanding are more or less equal. Now, we've already kind of touched upon how at the most basic level this is the case. Certainly the case of operating a bicycle properly stands out as a very good example. However, we can get even more basic than that. And we've hinted at this already when we said that when you're trying to look at something, you don't think about how to look at something. If you reflect for a second on how your eyes work, there is a hell of a lot going on in there. There are literally probably at least several dozen different muscles involved, for instance, in the act of you trying to focus on me at the head of the classroom. First, you have all the various teeny tiny little muscles around your eye. You have the teeny tiny little muscles inside your eye, which kind of flex the cornea. Not only that, but obviously you've got to keep your head erect in a certain angle. You may have to crane your neck around somebody else who is blocking your view at various times as I'm walking back and forth. You've got to keep your entire body at a certain posture, which is more or less conducive to seeing me properly. And you're doing this without thinking about it in an explicit focal manner. Your focus is me. You're not focusing on all the dozens, if not hundreds, of muscles and bones and nerves which you're using in order to actually bring me into focus. Now, multiply this throughout most of your other senses. I mean, definitely for this particular act of trying to see and understand what the hell I'm talking about, you're very, very engaged with two senses, obviously sight and sound. Less so with some of your other ones. But nevertheless, it's very much the case that you're tending focally to me while allowing the vast majority of physiological activities which are going on in your body to fall into the background in such a way that you can call them to attention if you really want to. You can really start focusing on the inside of your eye if you really want to. It'd be a very weird experience. It's easier, for instance, to focus on what's going on in your neck. However, once you're doing that, once you've shifted your focus, you're no longer really able to focus on what you really mean to do, which is to get something out of this lecture, which hopefully gets you through this class in one piece. So this is the very basic stuff. So even at the level of sensation and perception, tacit awareness is very much predominant. And though it is possible, especially through critical analysis and scientific analysis, to say a lot of very explicit stuff about these things, all the explicit information in the world about perception doesn't really help you perceive things. It just doesn't. In fact, any kind of explicit scientific knowledge or article you might read, or which you might compose someday, about perception or sensation, already presupposes a vast majority of tacit experience in doing those things, right? Nobody is going to, put it a different way. Nobody is going to take too seriously a treatise or scientific article on various shades of the color blue from somebody who is colorblind, right? You can't really capture blueness if you don't have some sort of experience of blueness. But having had the experience of blueness, you have some sort of real understanding of it. So that sort of tacit antecedent knowledge is required before the explicit analysis of the experience can come about. But let's skip up a couple of levels, because Polanyi has also made the claim that tacit knowledge also predominates at the loftiest height of human mental achievement. And by the loftiest heights of mental achievement, you can pretty much tell what he's talking about. He's talking about cultural achievements. He's talking about scientific achievements. He's talking about philosophic insights. He's talking about all the things which we recognize as being some of the most difficult and some of the most demanding acts of human possibility. And he would also put in there a lot of what we call them political achievements, or even feats of sheer human excellence, for instance, that achieved by a great athlete. We'd also include that as well. However, for our sake, we're going to concentrate on science and scientific knowledge, just because it makes things a little speedier. Now, what is he getting at here? I mean, you might very well ask yourself that, because oftentimes one is given at least the impression that what scientists do is that they look at facts and then they formulate quote-unquote theories based on the facts. So they see a bunch of explicit things, and then they make an explicit formula derived from that sensation or observation of the things, right? And Polanyi is not denying that that sort of thing happens in science all the time. It happens in human life all the time. However, that way of doing things, of simply looking at something which is taken more or less as given and formulating some kind of formula around it, that takes place mostly in that middle ground we were talking about, where the tacit and the explicit are more or less even, where you're kind of really engaged in what, well, basically is dianoetic thinking. That is, you're taking a bunch of things which are already taken for granted and simply working out some of the details. However, what happens when you turn your attention to something which is not simply obviously prefigured in what you already know, but something which you don't know at all? Now, this is one of the most ancient paradoxes that we have in the West, and not surprisingly, it's Plato who came up with it, or first observed it explicitly. And nowadays it's known as Meno's paradox. And this is a paradox which basically goes as follows. How can you know anything that you don't already know? If you don't know something, basically, how would you know when you start knowing it? And if you do know something, and obviously you didn't not know it to begin with. So the basic idea is that if you start from a basis of thinking that knowledge is only that which is explicit, then you have no way of accounting for acts of discovery. That is to say that unlike what we're terming as dianoetic thought or simply deductive reasoning, where you're simply working out the details of something which is already known to you, more or less, tacitly and explicitly, great acts of discovery necessarily are defined as discovering something which was completely unknown before. And how do you account for that? Certainly think of the theory of relativity as being an example of this. You can think of Newton's discovery of universal gravitation as an example of this. You can think of any number of things from your own life as examples from this. I mean, you don't know something until you know it, but how do you come to know it, right? And what Polanyi is arguing, particularly in essay 1 or lecture 1 of this book, but also in lecture 2 and throughout the book, is that he's going to try to show you that the act of making that kind of leap from what you know currently across that kind of logical gap to a new discovery itself entails a great act of tacit integration. That is to say, what he's arguing is that there's nothing mysterious or fundamentally mysterious or weird about the act of discovery, but that in a certain way, in order to know something new, whether or not you're a great scientist or you're simply you discovering something which is new to you for the first time, what you're doing is very much as you're taking a vast amount of explicit and tacit knowledge which is already inside you, which you already have, and animated by a spirit or a passion of intellectual curiosity or simply bafflement and a desire to actually figure things out, to know what's going on, to figure out what you're looking at, to give a name to it, you go through a more or less complicated process of integrating all the tacit particulars, all the subsidiary particulars of your knowledge and awareness in a new way. What he calls this is an act of comprehension. And the word comprehension literally means bringing together. So you're bringing together whatever you think bears upon the experience that you're trying to explain. Right? Anybody want to have a guess about what I'm getting at with that? Or is anybody completely baffled by what I'm getting at with that? Go ahead. Sorry, what's your name, by the way? Sorry? Talib?
Yeah. I don't know. I think you might be getting at the end of the day, you have to put like a philosophical spin on even scientific things for it to make sense.
Well, you can make it even more basic than that.
In science, like let's say like a bullet going through somebody is just a bullet going through somebody. It's not like a good or bad thing, you know. So you have to make like sense out of it, like philosophical reason.
You want to chime in?
Maybe going back to when you were talking about like the discovery of universal gravity,
Mm-hmm.
is we were always aware that when we drop something, it falls to the ground, but we never thought about it in like the implicit sense of why this happens. So it's taking the tacit knowledge and the explicit knowledge, and then the formulas and whatnot, combining them together to gain that understanding. So like even though we were all aware of, you know, the idea of gravity, like things fall when you drop them, it wasn't until it was thought about in the scientific explicit way that the tacit knowledge came into like effect, sort of.
Well, you definitely needed to have a particular way of looking at the world already. And then having developed inside yourself that way of looking at the world, it can sort of follow through on what may be implied in that way of looking at things, right? I should use another example which Polanyi uses. I mean, Polanyi uses, for instance, the example of, actually the even better one, discovering a new continent, right? Now, or even just discovering something which is new to you, or a new area of town, for instance. Now, there are a few different ways you can get to know your way around town. One way is to simply get off the plane or get off the bus, wherever, and walk around and just bumble around until such a time as you actually figure out the lay of the land, right? To make it even more obvious, any of you who've had to bumble around the low building for less than a few years probably still gets lost in the low building because it's really weirdly laid out. It doesn't really conform to a standard model of how buildings should be laid out. And so I'll oftentimes run into students and sometimes professors who have gotten lost on their way to wherever they're going because they get turned around very, very easily. Now, in my case, I've been going to low building for about 7 years now, give or take. And after about a year or two of it, I almost never get lost in low building anymore. Now, what explains that? It's not that I have a map, per se, of low building in my head. However, what you do in finding your way around a geographic space of some sort is that you sort of build up a gradual latent awareness of the place. Yeah? You've all had this experience where you continuously get lost someplace in a new neighborhood or a new place, or in the tunnels of Carleton University, until one day, somehow it's all kind of clicked together in the background, right? You've gone through a process of what Polanyi is terming a tacit integration of all the particulars, right? You're no longer explicitly aware of every single rock and pebble, wall, and obstacle in the course. Somehow or other, you're now able to let that fall a little bit more into the background, and then more and more and more, as you develop sort of a comprehension of the layout. Right? Now, the other way you can figure your way around town, or figure out your way through the tunnels, or through the low building, is that you can be given a map. This is an explicit bit of information about the layout of the land. or the layout of the building. And you can use it. And it might save you a lot of trouble. And in fact, a lot of the modern way of thinking about knowledge and thinking about information really puts a lot of emphasis about this thing, explicit. An explicit map, explicit information, explicit thing which does away with all the haphazards of learning things in the old-fashioned way of just bumbling around and easily figure things out. However, Polanyi points out something quite obvious about this, is that somebody has to make the map to begin with. Somebody already has to have some sort of comprehensive understanding, some tacit understanding of the thing, especially if you're talking about discovery of a new land or a completely new place which nobody from your culture has seen before, in order to become the map maker, right? Whatever else you might think of him, when Columbus landed where he landed, he wasn't using an explicit map. He had a bunch of, shall we say, theories about the world, theories which have been banging around in European intellectual culture for centuries, that the Earth possibly was actually round, and you might actually be able to go all the way around the world if you actually got on a ship and traveled west. However, even with those theories in mind, there was no actual explicit knowledge about what was actually west of Portugal. Not that far west, anyway. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah. Can you just like look at like most of these great discoveries was like very accidental, right? And so couldn't you just say that those tacit knowledge or tacit awareness is also accidental, right? Like even your example of like paying attention to you, right? There was a series, there was like how many thousands of years of evolution that taught the human being how to stand up straight, how to work the muscles to pay attention, and like had it not, been the mistakes of evolution, we would not have those certain inherent abilities to do those things.
All right, but let's drive it back and make it a bit more personal, though. I mean, was it evolution that taught you how to stand up?
In some ways, yeah.
Who is this person called evolution, and how did they teach you to stand up?
Person, it's just a process.
Okay, but in your own personal life. I mean, this is kind of one of the things which Polanyi is trying to point out, is that we have this tendency, and oftentimes it's a bad tendency because we do it inappropriately at times, to think in terms of abstractions. And so we talk about how this abstract force, the social force, for instance, made us do this. However, if you always keep it grounded in your own life, it's not evolution that taught you how to stand, it was your parents.
I think personal experience that you keep through trial and error.
Mm-hmm. Precisely. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, we've been going around about it, but experience actually plays a major role in both cases. If you're in the case of the person that just goes around and finds something, or if you're in the case of the other person that goes around and start applying the intellectual part of it due from experiences of going around, because you can't just have knowledge out of nothing. The knowledge has to start from scratch, just like the way we see the word for what it is. Back like 50 years ago, we didn't have plane that could just fly hours or days or weeks. Now we have planes that those are differences that just shows graduation and experiences. So experience plays a role in both sides you want to go, and knowledge doesn't come from anywhere except from just longing for it. You have to wait for it, or you have to work for it, like you said.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you want to complicate things, obviously, even if you're given an explicit map of a place you've never been to before, there's already a lot of tacit knowledge involved in your ability to actually read that map properly. That map has to be drawn in a way which makes sense to you in some fashion. You have to be able to make sense of it, right?
And
Yeah.
saying you already have some previous knowledge, you already have some previous experiences of how map works and stuff like that, Because if you don't, you can't read the map you've been
Exactly. And we're used to very particular things. We're used to Cartesian style maps done in a very simple, in a very way which is actually not simple, but it's simple to us because we're familiar with it. However, if we were given this same sort of maps to somebody in a vastly, vastly different civilization and different age, they wouldn't be able to make sense, very easy automatic sense of these sorts of maps because they'd never had any experience of them before. Sorry, Babby, then we'll go to Matt.
The author in the book talked about like the rat and the maze.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like the rogue example you give, or is that something like he compares it to an animal and find the way out?
No, it's very comparable. I mean, what Polanyi is talking about there, with the example of the rat and the maze, is very much the same thing. You know, sooner or later, the rat figures out the lay of the maze. We haven't taught the rat how to read a map. However, there's an active latent learning which is going on in the rat by which they've somehow integrated all the experience they've had of running around at random and slotted everything together in a proper way such that they really do have a true understanding or comprehension of how the maze is laid out.
Is there like a comparison? I don't know. Is the author trying to like compare like an animal to a human being and finding the way in that sense, or just
He is making the comparison. And like I said, he's making the comparison both at the simple level but also at a more complicated level. Because the argument he's going to make is that this also holds true in, as he says, the loftiest achievements of the human mind. For instance, the act of discovery of a new physical law, for instance. A really good example which springs to my mind, and maybe you guys have different examples which will make more sense for you, but one which springs to my mind is, okay, I'll use that one because it's just popping into my head. The discovery, for instance, of the phenomena of gravitational lensing, which some of you may not have heard of before. But it's this very interesting phenomenon by which it was discovered that a sufficiently large gravitational field, say around a very, very massive object, such as a large planet or a star or a black hole or something else of the sort, will have a gravitational field which is strong enough that it can actually bend light by a determinate degree. And that this phenomenon can actually be observed using a telescope if you have some sort of clue as to where to look for it. Now this, what is now an empirically verified fact of nature, or empirically verified fact, was first, it wouldn't even really say indicated, but it was almost sort of kind of hinted at in Einstein's theory of relativity. But Einstein's not the one who discovered this. There was a variety of other thinkers whose names I can't remember offhand who looked at Einstein's theory of relativity, understood it, decided it was absolutely true, and having seen it as absolutely true, came up with insights into further implications of this theory in other fields. So, for instance, a great deal of work came through in the field of quantum mechanics, or a great number of new insights were made into the realm of quantum mechanics. A great number of new insights were made in the realm of astrophysics and astronomy as a result of Einstein's theories. However, actually even a better one, a good one for poli-sci students, the atom bomb came out of Einstein's theories. But Einstein himself did not see the atom bomb coming. However, that little equation of E equals mc squared was seen to have implications that could not exactly be foretold by the person who first originally made the theories or discovered, those natural laws. Now, what you should do is you should step back and say, what would be required of me if I was going to be the person who look at this new discovery, this new fundamental law which has been discovered, these new theories, and actually leap to this new insight? Well, what you have to do, more or less, is that A, you have to accept these theories as true. You have to really believe they're actually true, and then they can verify them. And B, you need to use these theories as the subsidiary components of your attempt to discover something even further over the horizon. Right? So having accepted these theories as true, having determined for yourself that these are a completely accurate representation of reality, and being animated further by a passion to know even more. Polanyi is saying you kind of sense, if you're really good, you sense just a little bit. You get a tingle maybe in the back of your head of something which is just outside your field of perception. You're seeing implications here, but you don't know what's really being implied. But somehow what you know, what you know is true, is serving as a clue. And where he uses this clue. So you have clues now of something, but you don't know what the something is yet. It's just escaping you. And so what you need to do is you need to focus on what you don't know, but which is somehow implied in what you do know. Sorry, Matt.
Isn't what he is really saying is that there is no perfect, right, analytical distinction between the human mind's subjective and objective. There's no distinction. The dualism is there, but there's no real clean distinction that a human mind can make subjectively looking at something and objectively.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that's where we're eventually going. So there's the question: what is the difference between personal knowledge and that other term which moderns like to use all the time, subjective knowledge, right? Because you guys are taught that if you want to sound smart, there's subjectivity and there's objectivity, right? There's a subject-object relationship. And Polanyi is not the only person doing this, but for our purposes, he's really the only one doing this for this class. Is he's saying that this dichotomy, this dichotomizing, is not as strict as it looks like. Personal knowledge is not the same thing as subjectivity. Right?
Personal knowledge is not subjective.
Personal knowledge is not the same thing as subjectivity. Because, just out of question, I mean, when I accuse you of saying, well, that's just your subjective opinion, what am I saying about what you know? Right? It just means that's just all in your head, it's all relative, right? That doesn't bear on reality outside your own head or your own feelings. Now, what Polanyi is saying, or Polanyi is indicating, is it's not the case that somehow objective, or that what you know is somehow abstracted from your feelings and from the way in which you've been taught to apprehend the world. It's just that that's a very different state of affairs than saying that it's nothing more than a projection of your own feelings and your subjectivity. So in one way, what you can think of Polanyi as doing is that he's taking you out of this whole subjective versus objective debate, which has haunted the West since at least Descartes in the 16th century, where because we're so afraid of being subjective, we vacillate to the other side of being obsessed with objectivity, and thus with explicit knowledge, explicit ideas, and then vacillate back in the other direction when that becomes too much and start talking about the relativism of everything. And he's plugging you back in your real human experience, which is somewhere in the middle. That yes, if you don't feel passionately about understanding things, you don't feel passionate about the truth, you really will be a lousy scientist. In fact, you probably won't be a scientist at all. But on the other hand, he's also saying that if you are too obsessed with objectivity, you will also be a lousy scientist. Because it will cause you to dismiss a vast reservoir of knowledge, of your own knowledge, but also the knowledge of others, which cannot be made explicit.
So, your subjective knowledge, what drives your subjective knowledge? Isn't it driven by a feeling, like the way your mental state is, or is it driven by other like external sources? Because if your subjective knowledge is different from your personal knowledge, then I want to know what drives the subjective knowledge.
Hmm. Well, sometimes the best way, or at least a good way, of tackling questions like that is actually to look at the word which we're using and to submit it to critical analysis. Now, if we look at the word subjective, what does it really mean at the end of the day? We kind of use it and it gets bandied about a lot, but what does it actually mean? Now, to be the subject of something is literally, if you think about it, it literally means the same thing what we're kind of talking about when we talk about the relationship between a monarch and a subject, right? That the subject, or literally the subject, is somehow the passive, obedient recipient of some experience, right? And so talking about subjectivity in this fashion is to suggest, at least, that you are somehow literally passively being influenced by something outside of yourself which makes you what you are. That you're being molded by experiences, right? But passively. You're just sitting there. You're clay. You're a tabula rasa. You're nothing in particular, but you're being subjected to all these impacts, sensations, or influences upon you, which make you what you are. And you may add on to that you have these internal feelings which boil up from somewhere or other as well, but you're also subjected to them, right? Now, one of the things which Polanyi is saying is that while there are plenty, you will have experiences in life which approach this theoretical state of being completely subjective, of being completely subjected to something. That's not the vast majority of your experience. The vast majority of your experience is somewhere in the middle between activity and passivity, right? Once again, just think of the act of perceiving something. You cannot passively perceive something. It's a contradiction in terms, in fact. For you to actually perceive me, you have to go through various activities of arranging yourself in order to look at an object. And on top of that, you have to call or summon up a vast reservoir of your own previous knowledge to make sense of what you're seeing, right? Especially if it's something which is a little bit unfamiliar. But that's an act. That's not passive. In order to perceive something well, you have to actively strive to perceive it. So this is one of the ways in which Polanyi is very subtly dusting away, some of the dust bunnies of Western philosophy. Because once again, this whole subjectivity versus objectivity thing is a very peculiar obsession, which has only ever come about in the West. And one of the reasons why it's being sustained is because of our lack of analysis of what the words mean and our obsession with very extreme states. Objectivity is a very extreme state. Very few things in life are ever going to be objective. Arguably, and I think Polanyi would probably argue this far, is that there are things which are relatively objective, but almost nothing is completely objective because people have bodies and people have to learn and people have to learn how to see things in a certain way. And so there's always a certain amount of personal connoisseurship is a word he uses. Connoisseurship in how to know something which is relatively objective and can be readily verified by almost anybody. And there will be fairly extreme states in which you feel like you're just completely subjected to something or other. But even in that state, you're never completely inert. You're never just clay. You're never just clay, but neither are you ever just, some disembodied mind with no context. We're human. We're in the middle, always. And yet, in spite of the fact of being merely human, we do pretty well. Sorry, you had your hand up for a while.
Who does specify
I forgot it.
standard of precision, or that you are 100% of the...
That you're 100% what?
He spoke about the quality, the standard, but who does specify the standard?
The standard of what?
Standard of precision, of perfection, of that you are at the top,
Hmm.
the end.
That you are the top at the end?
Was speaking about Michelangelo.
Mm-hmm.
Was making structure, etc., and he didn't finish it. And he was speaking about who makes the ultimate end.
Okay, so standards. You're talking about standards in general. Yeah. Well, there are two different components to that. And they're mutually supporting, but they're also in tension. First and foremost, you or I as students would be pretty foolish to set up our own selves or our own ideas as the standard by which to judge, right? Ideally, what you want to do is you want to apprentice yourself to a master. What you want to do is you want to submit yourself to standards which are outside yourself. Now, they might simply be personally embodied in the recognized expertise of your master, as a master scientist or a master painter or a master sculptor or a master athlete, and attend to them focally. I try to understand them as well as possible by indwelling in every way they go about their lives. Try to be like them as much as possible. And thus submit yourself, actively submit yourself to that standard in order to improve yourself and improve your understanding. But at a certain point, or at certain moments in your life, you might be submitting yourself to, in a sense, what could be termed self-set standards. Because the ultimate standard to which you're attending, specifically if you're acting like a scientist or philosopher, and this is one key point which Polanyi does try to make in various instances, is that the ultimate standard is reality. Bare bones reality. Truth. God forbid we use that word in a classroom, but truth is the standard. But then you get into the tricky question of how do you determine what's true, right? That's obvious. And so that gets you back to what we were just talking about 20 minutes ago. When we're talking about the truth as it seems to be implicated, or the truth which seems to be hinted at in what you already know. So when we're talking, once again, using the example of Einstein's theory of relativity, Einstein's theories are accepted as true based upon a variety of standards of mathematical beauty and precision and so on and so forth, but then also ultimately verified through a bunch of different experiments which bore out the theories in usually spectacular fashions. But having now accepted those theories as true, and accepting as a standard the truth per se, or reality per se, and animated by your own desire to know, you go from that basis, that foundation, and then go a little bit further. You kind of launch yourself off in a new direction and try to get a little bit farther than Einstein did, and at least in a certain direction. So self-set standard there is really reality, but you're not launching yourself into reality from nowhere. You're just leaping into the void. You've climbed up, as I think Carl Sagan put it, you climb up onto the backs and the shoulders of giants in order to see farther.
But doesn't that go back to his main question, though, of standard? Because if you didn't tell me to reach out to a master, then how do I even determine the master? You said, okay, focus on reality. What are actually those realities? How do I confirm the realities? So basically, in a sense, just to answer my own question, I'm still submitting my own will to believe those are realities. Then that's how I'm going to actually pursue the reality that I'm believing that they're real. If you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And the simple human fact of the matter is that it's hazardous. It's dangerous, right? The most existential danger you will ever be in your life is when you have to finally choose a teacher. Because your teacher, your guru, is the person who can either help you blossom as a human being, help you go further and push you farther and help you up and turn you around and make you a better you than you ever would have been otherwise, or they can screw you up badly, right, by turning you in the wrong direction or exploiting you or a variety of other things. This is very flesh and blood obvious stuff, right? And so it's a danger, it's a gamble. And in a certain respect, there's no way of ever eliminating that from the human experience, no matter what anybody might tell you. However, we might have, for instance, really great institutions which try to mitigate those dangers to a certain extent, right?
So reality standard is dangerous? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is finding somebody to hold up as a standard for who you should be requires hazarding your guess that this is a good person, this is a great scientist.
I'm following reality, though. I'm following the fact that he has given to me. You know, I'm following the things he has given to me, shown to me that I'm a good person. Just like you said, you can't deny the truth. So if I'm taking him from what I've seen, what I've confirmed that he's a good person, then I follow everything that he gives to me.
Don't do it stupidly. Don't be a passive subject in the whole matter, right? You should actually test things out through your own experience. You should question every once in a while. You have no choice in a certain respect but to find a teacher. Where you're doing it all the time, whether you realize it or not. You know, your first teacher is usually your mother. Sometimes it's your father, but it's usually your mother. They teach you how to stand up. It's your mother who teaches you how to stand up. It's your mother who teaches you how to go from weird animal noises to something resembling speech, right? And you're trusting them. You're implicitly trusting them through love, affection, everything else of the sort. And that your parents are not turning you into a crazy person or an animal. Sometimes, though, parents are bad, right? There are some bad parents in the world. There are some abusive parents in the world. Now, all we're doing here, or all Polanyi is doing, is saying you can transfer this basic, reality of human life, and now you're transferring it outside the family context to the entire mental life of what it means to be a human being. You need teachers, but not all teachers are equal. And so you do have to have some way of distinguishing good teachers from bad teachers. Now, in the scientific or philosophic life, you have these wonderful, hopefully, encouragements to question. And a great deal of emphasis is put upon questioning. And so you have to strike this medium way between being just a completely passive peon to your teacher and being so argumentative that you never get anywhere. You have to question just enough, and you have to base it on your experience just enough. And you should always try to verify or validate or authenticate what's being sold. And that goes for you guys too. You shouldn't be taking everything I'm saying as the bloody truth, right? I mean, granted, you're second-year students of political science, and there's a bit of a gap between you and I in that respect, especially with regard to political theory. However, you've got some resources by which you can try to question or at least wrestle with what I'm saying. One is your own experience, but where your own experience isn't enough, you've also got the objective standard of the books you're dealing with. So if I say something about Polanyi, which strikes you as weird or nonsensical, you refer to the book. And then wrestle with what Polanyi is saying. And then come back at me, and we talk about it. And we see, okay, maybe I didn't express it properly. That is what I meant to get at, yada, 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 right? So to a certain extent, you have to accept what I'm saying, or you have to engage with what I'm saying and try to learn from what I'm trying to sell or trying to tell you. But on the other hand, don't just sit back passively and take whatever I tell you.
You have to accept the lies to be able to figure out the truth.
Well, I wouldn't say go so far as to say lies, but
When I mean lies, I mean at first they're all lies to you in a sense because you don't have true evidence to them until you start.
it's said the way saying lies say ideas.
Okay. Yes,
Not all ideas are lies. Some ideas are true. However, the difference between ideas and knowledge, by the way, and this is another distinction I want to make, is that ideas are abstract from you and from your experience. A lot of people have ideas. You met these people on the internet all the time. Half of them are engineers. Engineers on the internet, and I have a lot of friends who are engineers who post things on Facebook and whatever, have ideas about everything, and because they have ideas about everything, they think they know everything. I'm beating up on engineers, but it's not because I don't like them. The number of friends who are engineers who think they know everything about politics because they have ideas about it is incredible. However, they oftentimes don't have any understanding of it whatsoever. So yeah, you have to take ideas, but then you have to transform ideas hopefully into comprehension and knowledge. All right, we're going to take at least a 10-minute break, so you guys, bathroom break, coffee break, whatnot. Then we'll come back, we'll do groups. I went on for way too long.
So 4 or 5.
Yeah. So around 4:05.
Pick up my fiancé from work because I can't get a babysitter.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think your master could be very dangerous too, in the sense like if they, just like you said, if they choose to exploit you or they choose to show you what they only want to show you. Should I put
Can you
your student number?
put your student number? Because yeah, I'm not going to break it down per class because some people are really slower faster, and we're going to try to go over things at a pace that everybody can actually follow with. So,
Before June 16, we shut down all parts.
yeah. Yes.
And I'm actually going to leave because I didn't really eat too much last night. And
It didn't look like it.
I was like passing out, so I was just going to excuse myself today.
Okay. Don't worry too much about it. And
Can I sign in or what is that?
are you trying to take off early?
Oh, is that what that's for? Okay, never mind. I'm here, I guess.
No, I'm gonna pass around the attendance sheets when everybody comes back from the washroom. Do you want to?
Kind of, yeah. But I'll be here next
All right. We'll make it. Yeah. We'll make a regular habit of it, but everybody gets at least one act of mercy. Mm-hmm. And I completely forgot to turn this